All righty. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brenna Meneghini, and I am with FEMA Region 10 here based in Bothell, Washington. Today with me, I have Kayla Keelan. She's not going to be presenting, but she is going to be kind of behind the scenes to help answer any questions. So Kayla, if you wanted to say a little hi there.
All right, let's see if, am I coming through okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Kayla Keelan. I'm a hazard mitigation specialist here in FEMA Region 10, like Brenna said, and I work on the non-disaster grant program. I saw some familiar faces or names in the chat participants, so really excited to see you all and also looking forward to the conversations today. And like Brenna mentioned, I will just be in the background, kind of helping with polling questions as well as monitoring some of the chat. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Kayla. To help save our bandwidth today, I am going to turn off my video just so hopefully we don't have any snags in the connection. But again, I'm Brenna Meneghini. You may have heard from me before. I run our non-disaster grant team in FEMA Region 10 in our Hazard Mitigation Assistance branch. And what that means is we're a team of 5 who work on our non-disaster grant programs. And one of them today that we're discussing is the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Community Grants, BRIC. So if you've joined us today, we're just going to be doing our introduction to the program, introduction to BRIC, and how the grant program works and what type of funding is available under it. Next slide. So here is our tribal webinar schedule, which you may have seen if you're here today. Today we're doing that introduction, but you can see next week we're discussing capability and capacity building, planning and application development. So same time next week on Thursday for hazard mitigation plans. And down at the bottom there is the link of where the recordings will also be, as well as the link to register if you need to register for any of the future webinars. Next slide. So housekeeping, just to keep everything moving well today, everyone is on mute, but we welcome questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to either shout them out, type them in. We will go ahead and try to answer them as they come in or where they fit in the presentation. And we'll also have some time at the end if you would like to save any for then as well. So you can ask them right in the chat box, and we will make certain to answer those. We also have some interactive knowledge checks, so just kind of to reiterate some of the information that we're learning today together. And these are anonymous, so don't feel like it's you need to get the answer 100% right. These are anonymous. And then if you have any technical issues, go ahead and send a chat directly to the host in the chat box, and Michelle will work behind the scenes and see if we can fix that issue for you. And at the top of your participants panel, you'll be able to see where you can drop down and ask some questions, access the chat, and see participants. Next slide, please. All right, so today here is our basic agenda for what we're going to cover today. So we're going to discuss what mitigation is. We're going to go over BRIC fundamentals and the overview of the program. We're going to discuss the application process and timelines. We're going to discuss where more resources can be found, and then we're going to have questions and answers. Next slide. All right, what is mitigation? So in your screen here, you're going to see some examples of kind of thinking ahead to mitigation. So for example, you'll see at the bottom here. So what if a wildfire burns, but homes were not threatened because landowners trimmed the branches, they trimmed the vegetation and forests around their home, creating a defensible space, right? So the fire, when it came, it wasn't able to hop to that house because there was a clear area around that house. So that's really mitigation in action, right? It's the result of residents, professionals in the community, just anyone in the community, community planners, engineers, elected officials. It's really a result of them doing these mitigation actions before a disaster occurs. You'll see some other examples there on the left of your screen. But what we like to say is you can't remove a hazard, right? But you can lessen the impact on your community. So for example, I live here in Bothell, and the West Coast here in Washington State is well known that we're due for a large earthquake. However, I could move, but I'm certainly not going to move because my family's here, my friends are here. So what can I do, right? How can I lessen that impact of the hazard? So I could look at options like perhaps moving further from any risky areas for tsunamis after that earthquake would occur, right? There's a risk of tsunami, so perhaps I move further away from the water. Then there's other options like retrofitting my home, so rather both structurally and inside. So like putting bracing on shelving, things like that. So if an earthquake did occur, my shelves aren't going to fall down and hurt anyone, hurt any kids, hurt pets, family members, things like that. So again, we can't really always remove that hazard, but you can help impact or lessen that impact to your community, and that's what mitigation is. Next slide, please. So here you'll see our definition of mitigation on your screen. And mitigation is that reduction or elimination of a long-term risk to human life and property from hazards. And this helps create a strong, resilient tribal community, right? So your community becomes stronger and more resilient from those hazards. So on this little, one back there, Michelle. Right, this little image you'll see here, mitigation can occur in many different ways and can occur in any really point of the disaster cycle. You'll kind of see this typical cycle here. So you can have mitigation ahead of time, right? And that's where we kind of can blur the line with preparedness. For example, as I was talking about the seismic retrofits of my home, I haven't done that yet, right? But if I'm thinking about doing that, I haven't yet been in that big earthquake. So that would be kind of where that action is falling there. So before a disaster occurs. So I know when that disaster does occur, I'm going to have a less impact on me and my family. And then on the right side, you're going to see here, these are options for mitigation after a disaster. So for example, if a disaster did occur and let's say a bridge got toppled over with water and it crumbled, if let's say it somehow fell apart, or perhaps a culvert, that might be a little bit more realistic. A culvert had a very large flood occur and overtopped the culvert, flooding occurred on the streets, things like that. So that would be a chance for, okay, that disaster had been lived through, so now how could we make it better, right? You could certainly build the culvert back the same way, or perhaps, it still functions in the same way even though it floods, but what could you do now to help prevent that in the future since that disaster did occur? You could perhaps build a larger culvert and upsize that. You could build a bridge, and that's where in this side here, that portion of mitigation can occur after a disaster. Next slide. So here on your screen, you're going to see these little blue bubbles, and these are basically mitigation activities that are available under BRIC. And we're really going to be going into each one of these more specifically later, but you can see there's planning and planning-related activities, mitigation project activities, project scoping, building codes, partnerships, and of course, our management costs. And to the next slide here, we're going to discuss in more in depth, these are mitigation activities, but projects. So here on your screen are typical mitigation projects. Now these, it's important to show or note that these are not the only type of mitigation projects that are eligible. So you'll see, infrastructure retrofits, structure elevations from floods, as I was mentioning, those retrofits, like for example, that upgrade to a bridge for a culvert that is undersized, structural retrofitting of existing buildings and facilities, such as I mentioned, retrofitting a home for an earthquake. Non-structural retrofitting, so that would be like embracing of materials inside, like that example with bookcases, things like that. But again, this is not a fully exhaustive list. For example, we have several projects, whether funded or in the works right now to be funded, for tsunami evacuation shelters here on the West Coast. And as you can see, there is no project activity listed here for that. So this was taken from our 2015 HMA guidance, the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance. And what this is it walks through all our programs, eligibilities, basic application requirements. And it lists these as eligible project activities. But again, this is just a sample list that does not include everything. So that's why we like to say, you know, it's not necessarily ineligible if it's not on this list. There are other mitigation projects. It's not a fully exhaustive list. Next slide, please. All right, so these next few slides here, we're going to see some mitigation project examples. So here is a seismic retrofit example. And this one specifically is a structural seismic retrofit example. So here is a water reservoir, and you can see that it's new bracing on the outside and some flexible connections down at the bottom. And what these are is it helps reinforce that reservoir. So if an earthquake does hit this area that is prone to earthquakes, the reservoir has a lot less likely chance of failing. And so that water is going to be able to be reliable for the community members in this area. Next slide. So here's another example, and this one is a backup generator for a critical facility. You can see that generator is on that pad there, and our grants can fund generators as a standalone project as long as it's for a critical facility. And we really leave that up to you and your tribal government to decide what's a critical facility. So for example, you know, perhaps the water systems, reservoirs, perhaps a community shelter, community some type of community gathering center, perhaps for if there was any, you know, event that people had to flee to, and that's a kind of like a backup shelter. So we really leave it up to you and your community to define what is a critical facility. Next slide. And here is an example of a wildfire and post-wildfire mitigation example. So you can see here on your right, this is actually not yet completed, but you can see, so there's a lot of brush here around a critical water facility. And what this project will do is create defensible space. And defensible space is removing of vegetation around this reservoir to help ensure that if a fire does occur in this area, that the reservoir is safe and the tribal community has access to their water. And as you can see there is a note. We can also fund wildfire and post-wildfire mitigation projects. So that's things such as defensible space, like on that right photo we just discussed, ignition-resistant construction, so helping you know, roofs and buildings not light on fire, flash flooding prevention measures, reseeding of areas after flood, items like that. Next slide. And here is another example of an infrastructure protection example. So you can see here, this is a picture on your right of a culvert, and this specific example had the culvert was undersized essentially. There were several instances where it would, the floods would become too much and the water would go over to the areas and flood the roads. So you can see here down at the bottom, that's the photos from the after the mitigation project, and it has now been, a bridge was now constructed, which prevents, it's now higher, right? So the water is able to maintain in that stream and not kind of go above that culvert, because again, now it's now a bridge, and so the water stays within that area. So our grants can also fund, infrastructure protection for roads, bridges, utility systems. We can we could help fund projects that help protect against erosion, flooding of roads. So like, for example, these projects on the right, flooding on bridges, streets, wastewater treatment retrofits, similar to like the other examples we saw. And there's some other additional examples on your screen there. Next slide. All right, so here we get to the list of ineligible activities or ineligible projects. And what this is a list that's on our HMA guide. It's in our HMA guidance, and we like to just highlight some of these items because we do get quite a bit of questions about some of the things. So, for example, I won't read through these all, but things like construction a new building or new facilities. So a lot of the time we get inquiries about building a new emergency operations center. That's an example that we cannot fund because we can't construct a new facility that does not exist, right? That's not necessarily mitigation. For example, though, if that emergency operations center existed and it needed to be elevated because it had multiple floods, that's an eligible project. Some other items here is fundamentally, right, our program has to reduce the risk to people, structures, property, life, infrastructure. So if your project does not reduce that risk to people, to structures, to infrastructure, then it's not eligible, right? So a project must increase that level of protection. Another thing that we get asked about quite a bit is preparedness measures and response equipment. Those are items that we can't fund either. So for example, fire trucks, water, if you maybe needed a new water reservoir for firefighting, that wouldn't be eligible. And this one's really important that I like to highlight here, projects for which physical work has already occurred. So any work that has occurred prior to the grant award. And this is really important because our program does have to go through an environmental and historic preservation review to make sure projects comply with national environmental laws. So this is really important because it cannot be done if physical work has already occurred. So it's really important if you're going to submit for a project that you don't start any physical work until that grant has been awarded to you. Next slide. All right, let's do our first knowledge check here. All right, so on your screen you should see a little poll come up. And again, this is anonymous, so don't feel bad if you get it wrong. We'll go over this. But the question is, what is an eligible mitigation project? So A, projects that are dependent on another phase of a project in order to be effective. B, projects that address repairs or replacement. Or C, projects that reduce the risk to people, structures, or infrastructure. And we'll give a couple of minutes here as people type in their A, B, or C answer. All right, let's give a few seconds here. If you haven't yet, go ahead and choose A, B, or C. All right, well, everyone actually did really great here. It looks like people were pretty unanimous in what is an eligible mitigation project and projects that reduce the risk to people, structures, or infrastructure. So that is the correct answer, C, projects that reduce the risk to people, structures, or infrastructure.
Hey, Brenna.
Yeah.
before we move into the next section, I just wanted to flag a question that came up and just see if we wanted to add any more context to it. And the question being, does mitigation funding include identification and planning for implementation? So for example, identify locally appropriate mitigation measures and funding for implementation, or is it implementation of known measures? Which you did answer a little bit too, but wanted to see if you wanted to provide any more context. I know project scoping is something we will be speaking about in regards to identifying mitigation measures, but if you want to expand upon that, please feel free.
Yeah, thanks, Kayla. Yeah, there's certainly a couple ways that you could approach this. So with hazard mitigation planning, the planning activity, your hazard mitigation plan could identify appropriate mitigation measures in your community. So you could put that in your mitigation plan for like let's say your top projects, or perhaps you could list, every project you'd like in your community, or you could list, your top at-risk structures, homes, items like that. There's also then from there, there's the ability to apply for what's called project scoping. In project scoping, you could apply to develop these projects. Or you could use project scoping to help identify alternatives. So let's say you know a hazard, but you don't necessarily know the best type of project, and you want to look at all the options for a project. So that is an example you could also apply. And then, of course, the funding for the actual project, the implementation of the project, then you could also apply for a project for that for BRIC. So there's definitely a couple ways to go about it, but your mitigation plan can certainly help identify and plan for what type of projects you want to be looking for, and then project scoping could help probably get you more of those designs, or perhaps just look generally at types of solutions, and then of course the actual project can be applied for as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And then we had just one more question pop up in the chat, if we want to address it here. Is if a hazmat spill takes place as a result of an emergency, how can FEMA help mitigate with BRIC?
That's a good question. So there's a couple things to that. So one type of ineligible project types, and as we saw on the last screen, is hazardous material or hazardous waste. So this is not something that FEMA could clean up with a project grant through BRIC. So our projects do have, like let's say you do have a project that is on a site that has some hazmat or hazardous waste, that would have to be certified clean at grant expense, or non-grant expense, excuse me, before a project could take place. So that's not something our program can clean up itself, but there are some other programs out there more response-oriented that answer that issue for hazmat spills. Now, if there's no current hazardous waste, hazardous material on that site, but you want to help mitigate a future disaster for, let's say, some type of spill, you could look into some type of mitigation measures to prevent that hazard. So let's say there is a critical facility that houses something that's a hazardous waste. Items you could look at, maybe some retrofitting. Does the structure contains it need to be elevated? What's the hazard? So is it a flood that comes into the area and then the waste leaks into the water? Is it crumbling from erosion and the waste is leaking in that way? That would be items that we could look at to help mitigate, but we wouldn't be mitigating the hazmat spill itself. It'd be helping prevent that. So if for hazmat spills, that's certainly more of excuse me, not EHP, the Environmental Protection Agency, excuse me. Yeah. So go ahead and let us know if that doesn't answer your question, and we can address it more later too.
It sounds like we're good, and that's the last question for now. Thanks.
Great, thanks. All right, let's move on here.
Brenda, did you want that second poll about which is not an allegation?
Yes, let's do that second poll as well. You're right, I forgot we got 2 polls here. All right, so now we just have one more poll question. So what is not an eligible mitigation project then? So here are some examples we have on our screen. So A, a relocation project due to erosion and flooding hazards. B, a backup generator for a tribal clinic. C, constructing a new tribal facility such as an emergency operations center. Or D, defensible space surrounding an identified critical facility. And again, the question is, what is not an eligible mitigation activity? So go ahead and type in your bubble, which one is your choice. All right, we'll give it a few more seconds here. Make sure to get your option in. And again, what is not an eligible mitigation project for those choices? All right, so we have a little bit of a mix here. So what's not an eligible mitigation project? The answer is C, constructing a new critical facility, such as an emergency operations center. So as we mentioned in the previous slides, constructing a new critical facility is not an allowable expense and an allowable activity under BRIC. A backup generator, that's certainly a eligible activity as long as it's, for a hazard. Perhaps your tribal clinic loses power quite frequently from storms or floods, probably storms. So that is eligible. Relocation project due to erosion or flooding hazards is an eligible activity. And defensible space, as we saw on that example slide, defensible space for wildfires surrounding identified critical facility or home, structures. Yes, that is an eligible activity. So C, good job here. All right, let's move on. All right, so now we're going to discuss the program overview for BRIC. So what are the fundamentals of BRIC? There's quite a lot of information out there about our program, right? So what do you really need to know? So BRIC is a nationally competitive grant program. And what this means is it comes out annually in a notice of funding opportunity, and it releases to grants.gov. And this document outlines the amount of funding available, deadlines, so when you need to apply by, where you apply, what type of activities are allowed. It's really the big document that lists everything for our grant program. This program is relatively new. So for fiscal year 21, this cycle that is now, or is open soon, this program has been authorized under the Disaster Reform Recovery Act of 2018. So this act, the DRRA, we call it, from Congress, they authorized this program in 2018, and then the BRIC fiscal year 20, which closed in January of 21, that was the first cycle. And we are about to open here for that next cycle for BRIC fiscal year 21. And something important to note is it replaces the pre-disaster mitigation program. If you have heard of that program before, it does replace that program. So what that means is that program is no longer going to be issuing any new NOFOs. It's not going to have an annual cycle appear on grants.gov every year. So BRIC does replace that. So now eligibility. A federally recognized tribe can apply directly to FEMA as the grant applicant in our program. And you'll see here on the next slide as we discuss, you can also apply as a sub-applicant, but you can also apply in our program as a grant applicant. Now, if you're applying as a grant applicant, so you are having that government-to-government relationship with the U.S., the U.S. federal government, the tribe or village has to be located in or have received a major disaster declaration. So it can be partially located in or fully located in a state that has had one in the past 7 years. So for example, if your tribe is located kind of within 2 state boundaries, and one of those states has received a major disaster declaration in the past 7 years, your tribe would be eligible. And as of spring 2020, with the coronavirus pandemic, all states have received a major disaster declaration, so all federally recognized tribes and territories satisfy this criteria as spring 2020. Next slide. Okay, so here's some more fundamentals about our program. So BRIC is a pass-through and reimbursement-based grant program. So what does a pass-through grant mean? So a pass-through grant means we review our applications and we award that grant money to an applicant who then becomes the grant recipient. And that recipient can either, as a federally recognized tribe, can be the recipient and keep that money and pass it to essentially themselves as the subrecipient, or apply through a state and the money would then pass through that state entity onto a local government, a local community as the sub-applicant. So when I say applicant and sub-applicant is prior to award. So if you're applying, you haven't necessarily gotten that grant yet. And then a recipient and then sub-recipient would be after that award has been made. So a federally recognized tribe can be the applicant and sub-applicant. So right, they're essentially passing through to yourself here. Or you can be a sub-applicant to the respective state. So all of our, for example, our program, when a state applies, so for the example, the state of Washington, when they apply, and let's say a city, our big city here, city of Seattle, if they apply, the Washington state would receive that money and then pass it through to their sub-applicant, the city of Seattle. So as a federally recognized tribe, you do have that ability to either be that applicant yourself or be a sub-applicant to a state that you are located in. So as you can see on your screen here, applicants versus sub-applicants. So what does it mean? So applicants apply directly to FEMA. For example, we start going through your application. Let's say your application's ready to go. We're going to make that award. You do have to fill out what's called a financial risk assessment, and this goes through your financial systems to make sure that they comply with the regulations, the 2 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations 200, which is a large section on grants and procurement through grants. The next thing you'll see on this is a financial desk review. So what this means is our grants program division, who is a little bit separate than us, they handle primarily the finance and manage the grant, where we manage the program side of our grants. They do what's called a financial desk review. So they review your grant and make sure things are procured properly. They make sure that your regulations, or excuse me, your controls are in place to make sure, you know, there's no funding going to other items that weren't approved in the grant for things that aren't, you know, what the money was for, things like that. So they're making sure internal controls of those finance systems are well, and they're doing a check, and then provide recommendations if they find some things that could be a little bit more tightened, anything that perhaps the tribe would benefit from to strengthen. So this is similar to what states go through. They also go through the same process as well. They do receive that financial desk review as well. And then quarterly reporting. So quarterly reporting is done both performance-based and financial-based. There are separate forms for both, but they're submitted quarterly at the same time. And these, as an applicant, so or a recipient, so you have that grant at that point, they are required to be submitted quarterly to FEMA. The next thing here you'll see is the submitting reimbursement request. So you are the one directly submitting those reimbursement requests to the FEMA payment system, and you are drawing down those funds yourself. And then another important thing you'll see here at the bottom is the applications are due for BRIC by the end of the application period listed in that NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Whereas if you apply to the state, now we'll go to this other side on the right. If you apply to the state may put their own deadline. So for example, our program this year for fiscal year 21 is due by the end of January. I'm forgetting the exact date. I believe it's January 28th. But we do have a slide for that at the end. But for example, if you are applying to the state of Washington, they might want to receive their sub-applications earlier, right? Because they want to do their own review of them as well before they submit them. Now, if you're applying as the applicant, again, you can just comply with that date listed in the NOFO. So here we go on the right side, we're looking at what it means to be a sub-applicant. So you would be applying through the state. Your quarterly performance and financial reporting would go to the state. It wouldn't go directly to FEMA. And then you would submit those reimbursement requests to the state. And then sub-applications, as I kind of just mentioned there, they would be due earlier to the state because they usually want to do their own review. And then there could be any other state requirements. So a lot of the times, one of the things I hear is like a kickoff meeting. The state will, when they issue that award to you, after FEMA has issued that award to the state, they would be doing a kickoff meeting where they go through reimbursement requests, quarterly reporting, how the state's finance system works. So for example, like if you had to change, if you were wanting to make budget changes, things like that. So there's, again, so I know that's a lot of information, but that is one of the fundamentals. As a federally recognized tribe, you can be that applicant and sub-applicant, or you could be a sub-applicant to your respective state. And really, there's no correct answer here. It's up to you and your tribe and your community and your government to decide what is best for your tribe. There is no right answer. You know, some tribes may find that they like to work through the state, and perhaps it's less paperwork, or they might find that they want to be an applicant and come directly to FEMA. And so it's really up to you and your government. Next slide.
Hey, Brenna, actually,
yeah.
Before we pop to the next slide, just a question that came up, wanted to bring it up here. Are you able to, the question is, are you able to pass through to another entity within your community?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, to an extent. So let's say we have a federally recognized tribe who's applying to FEMA directly. I'm going to throw one out here that I know who has a representative on. The Tulalip tribes of Washington. So let's say the Tulalip government applies directly to FEMA, and they can be the applicant, and then a sub-applicant, like let's say their police department wants to be the sub-applicant and pass through that money to the police department. That's an example that that could be eligible because the sub-applicant is within that tribal government. Now, if you're wanting to pass through the money to a private nonprofit, a private business, those aren't eligible because eligible sub-applicants in our program can only be either a tribe as a federally recognized government or a local community, such as a county, a borough, a city. So it would have to be an entity from one of those. So again, that example, like a police department, or perhaps, let's think of a different, like you have another type of tribal government entity that wanted to be that sub-applicant, they certainly could be as well.
Thank you, Brenna. And actually a follow-up to that, how about a village, corporation, or city?
So a village, city could, you mean, I guess I would need some more information on that. So like if a federally recognized tribe applied as the applicant and they had perhaps like multiple tribes, and they were also a federally recognized tribe, but within the tribe there was also kind of, you know, federally recognized tribes that there are a few situations like that in Alaska. That could be, but no, a corporation is not eligible. So for example, a federally recognized tribe would get, if they were the applicant, and then a sub-applicant would be like one of the tribal corporations. No, that's not eligible, because an eligible sub-applicant has to be a government or local community government or federally recognized tribe. It cannot be a for-profit, a non-profit. That's a private entity. There is another program called Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and private nonprofits are allowed to apply as sub-applicants in that program. So that would be an avenue to look at if that was something you're interested in. I also see one other question here. I'll just briefly note here. So if a grantee is waiting to hear back about a prior grant BRIC submission, should the tribe plan on submitting for the current NOFO, in the current NOFO for the same project, or will awards for fiscal year 21 be announced early enough that we could submit for another project? Is it possible to have two FEMA BRIC projects? So all of our current selections, so in July, headquarters announced those fiscal year 2020 selections for BRIC. All of those are currently going through our review at our office, and what that means is our final checks are being done. For example, a lot of the times there might be a missing form, there might be a couple tweaks to a scope of work. Maybe, for example, like we're having a hazard mitigation plan, and the applicant said they were going to look at man-made hazards in their hazard mitigation plan. Well, we can only fund natural hazards. So those kind of things we kind of work through with you. But as an applicant, if you had a selection announced in BRIC fiscal year 2020, which is available at FEMA's website, yes, that means you've been selected, and those are going through review right now in our office, and you should be hearing from us in the next coming months. So there shouldn't be any need for you to resubmit that project again. Basically, that selection means that money is being held for you after the region does their review and works through any nuances or changes needed in that application that will be awarded. So there shouldn't be any need to resubmit that. I mean, you certainly can, but there really is no need to. And then, is it possible to have two FEMA BRIC projects? So I guess let me back up a little bit. So there was another point to that question. Will awards in fiscal year 21 be announced early enough we can submit for another project? So what I would recommend, so let's say if your tribe received a selection through BRIC fiscal year 20, but is still waiting on that grant award, I would certainly recommend applying for another project in BRIC 21, this application period opening, because you can have multiple grant projects or multiple grants at the same time. So let's say, you know, you get that fiscal year 2020 grant, and then next year you find you've been selected for another project for fiscal year 21. It would just be a different grant. But yes, you can have multiple grants. We have several tribes who have multiple different grants at the same time. All right. So yeah, if you know, we have lots, and I would actually just kind of highlight there, if you have an active hazard mitigation plan, submit away. There's a lot of tribes who do submit funding for projects or other activities every single year. So do that. I mean, that's a great way to maximize your funding and maximizing your applications. All right, so this is just the BRIC route we just went through. And again, what just to take away from that is you can be an applicant and the sub-applicant, or you can be a sub-applicant to the respective state. It's up to you and your tribal government to decide what is best. Next slide. All right, so here's kind of our cool overview for the funding available this year. So this is the BRIC FY21, fiscal year 21 offering. And why it's called fiscal year 21 is because the fiscal year it's opening is 2021. right, this current year, even though the deadline for that application period will close in January, which is fiscal year or calendar year 2022. So that's just kind of nuance behind that, that language there. But we're in fiscal year 21 right now, and so that's why it's called Building Resilient Infrastructures and Communities, BRIC, fiscal year 21. So here you'll see on your screen how the funding is kind of broken up. So there's $1 billion available nationally right now. And you're going to see at the top, these are uses of assistance. So these are different type of categories that the funding falls into. So we have state and territory allocations, and that is $56 million. So that is, if you look down at the bottom, it is $1 million federal share for each state. And that can be combined of management costs, what you see on the left, management costs, capability and capacity building activities, and mitigation projects. And we'll go into more details of what that C and CB, capability and capacity building activities, means in the next few slides. And then you'll see here the $25 million tribal set aside right in the middle of your screen. And that is $1 million federal share as well per tribe. And it could be used for management costs, capability and capacity building activities, and mitigation projects. So as we go through these next few slides here, we'll look at what that tribal set aside means. And then at the very end, you'll see on your screen here is $919 million is available for national competition for projects. So what this means is, and then you can see kind of on the far right, is up to $50 million federal share per project. So what this means here, let's say your tribe has a $3 million federal share project. That means if you submit that project for $3 million federal share, it would go into the national competition because it's over that federal $1 million federal share tribal set aside. So that's really important to think about when you are submitting things to maximize your funding. If you are applying directly to FEMA as a grant applicant, to maximize your funding, what I recommend is applying to the tribal set aside, so up to that $1 million federal share through different activities. So, you know, it could be a combination of projects, management costs, capability and capacity building activities. And then if you have projects that are over that $1 million, to also apply for those and just know those do go into the national competition. And they can be up to $50 million federal share. But you definitely want to, if you have projects over that, you want to do that, but you also want to make sure you're maximizing that set aside as well, because that does not go into the national competition. Next slide. All right, so what does that set aside actually mean? So what it means is up to $1 million federal share per tribe of these types of activities can be funded as long as they meet minimum requirements and basic criteria. So what does that kind of mean, right? So it means that you can apply for various activities up to that $1 million federal share, and it'll be funded as long as that meets that basic criteria. So for example, capability and capacity building activities, which will go into what that category means, it can only be funded by the tribal set aside. So that's really important. The national competition is only for projects, so you really want to maximize your funding here for activities that are not for projects. Within this capacity and capability building, up to that 500,000 federal share can be used towards mitigation planning or plan related activities. So if you don't have a hazard mitigation plan, up to 500 federal share can be used as part of that $1 million federal share, can be used for hazard mitigation planning. And then it really can be made up of what you and your tribe find useful. So it can be made up of a mix of C and CB activities, so planning, maybe project scoping, or it could be all projects, just $1 million project, for example. Or it could be, you know, two $500,000 projects. So it's not going to look the same for every tribe. It can really be a mix depending on how you want to fit that funding around. And then again, really important, that projects over that 1 million federal share go into that competition. So if you apply for let's say you're applying for a project and it's a 1.5 million federal share, it'll go into the competition. So it's really important that you're strategic if you're applying for both to make sure you're maximizing that tribal set-aside, but then also making sure that you have a project to go into the competition. And then the applications still meet basic criteria. So for example, if you are submitting a $1 million project and it's, it's eligible, it's $1 million, it's within that tribal set-aside of that 1 million federal share, it still must include a benefit cost analysis to show it's cost effective. Or for example, if you're submitting project scoping application, you still have to provide a scope of work and the basic criteria in the 2015 Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance. So you can't just submit an application with 2 words. We still need more details, things like that. So it has to meet that basic criteria. Next slide. Okay, so then what I like to include here is, so we have these different funding mechanisms, right? So what's in a typical grant application and what does that look like? So the way I kind of like to describe this, and I know it's a bit silly, especially for those who've heard me talk about it before, but is think of a shopping cart. So in this scenario, you would be that applicant and the sub-applicant. So in this scenario, you are holding that shopping cart and then you're putting items in your shopping cart. So you're also, you're putting that food in your shopping cart. So the grant is that shopping cart and it's holding all the sub-grants. And the sub-grants are for each individual activity. So for example, you can see here there's building codes, there's project scoping, there's a hazard mitigation plan, and there's a project. So this is just a general this is me just throwing some numbers out there saying if I was a tribe, here's an example what I would apply for my community. So you can see there at the bottom, out of all those figures, the grant total would be 1.1 million. And then in this example, that federal share then would be 990,000, and then the local match would be 110,000. And this is based on the formerly small and impoverished criteria you may have heard of, or what is now known with this year as the economically disadvantaged and rural communities cost share, the 90% federal, 10% local. So this is kind of an example here. That grant is like a shopping basket. It holds all of these activities. So for example, you don't apply just for the grant and then have you're like, I'm going to do 10 things with this grant. You apply for the grant, but then each activity that you want to accomplish has to be a separate sub-application. So in these examples, you see there's, again, that building codes, the project scoping, the plan update, the project. So you have to have that grant application and you have to submit those sub-applications to it as well, and then submit that grant application to FEMA. So that grant application, it's the holder of everything. It's that shopping cart that you're putting the individual items in. Next slide. All right, so what's the cost shares for our grant programs? And first, I just want to note that we do get a lot of feedback about changing our cost shares. And I will say that it's actually within the Stafford Act and the DRRA that has this criteria. So this is specifically a cost share from Congress. So this is not something that FEMA can change. So with that, what is the cost share? So the cost share standard, the standard cost share is 75% federal and 25% local. So what that means is that federal share cannot exceed 75%. So if you're applying for 77%, no, it's got to be 75% or less. Can't exceed that 75. And then we also have the economically disadvantaged rural communities cost share. You'll see on the right of your screen. And this is formerly known as the small and impoverished community cost share. So if you've heard of that one and you're familiar with that one, it's that same cost share and criteria. It's just now changed the wording. It's called economically disadvantaged rural communities. So it's 90% federal share or up to 90% and 10% local. And it's really important that you request this in your application and you include that documentation to the criteria. So what is the criteria? So the criteria is a community of 3,000 individuals or fewer, and then it has to be economically disadvantaged. So, for example, that specifically in the NOFO is listed at 80% or less of the national per capita income. And this is kind of an odd item to find out there. It can be a bit of a struggle sometimes depending on your community, but one of the most helpful resources I've found is My Tribal Government, or I believe in My Tribal Census. If you Google that, there's a survey done similar to the American Community Survey, which provides a per capita income. And so that's the one I find most helpful if you don't have that available. And if you can't find this information yourself, please do reach out to us, and you'll see our email at the end. We'll be happy to try to locate it for you. And at the end of the day, if none of us can find this information, because again, it can be a little bit of a struggle sometimes, depending, if you have a very small community, we're happy to accept a letter from your tribal government and a tribal official representing your government that states that you meet that criteria. But again, we're happy also to help look for that. So if you need assistance and are not able to locate it, we're happy to help look as well. But again, what to take away from this is you have to ask for this in your application. So if you think you meet this criteria, please request that in your application, because we cannot change it after the fact. Next slide. I also see a question that just came in. Oh, hi, Kayla.
Yes, perfect, thanks. I was going to say show the website one more time.
So, yeah, I also saw a great question that came in. So a question came in is, if a tribe received a BRIC grant or a pre-disaster mitigation grant, or let's say maybe a flood mitigation assistance grant, is the tribe still able to apply under this grant? Yes, you can apply every fiscal year. You don't need to wait until your existing grant is closed out. So, for example, we have several tribes that apply every single year and are successful every single year. It just means they have several different grants with us that they are doing reporting on and completing the project or other activities that they had applied for. So you can certainly apply every year. You don't have to. You can apply 1 year and wait until that one closes. But again, that's not required. You are welcome to apply every year. All right, next slide, please. All right, so what can BRIC fund? So BRIC can fund mitigation projects. So that was that big $919 million on the right of the screen before. So those are mitigation projects that increase resilience and reduce the risk of injury or loss of life, and reduce damage and destruction of property and critical services or facilities. So I want to highlight here on the right of your screen, at the top, you'll see this hazard mitigation assistance guidance. We have some links for these at the end, but this is a super critical document. Basically, what this is almost everything that we look at as well when we're doing our reviews. So take a look at that if you have any very specific questions for projects, or maybe you need some ideas. There's also some different project types in there. So again, BRIC can fund mitigation projects in that national competition, that 919, or in the tribal set-aside. So you could submit a project for that 1 million federal share. You could submit a project for 250,000 federal share, 500,000 federal share, up to that 1 million. So there's 2 different ways that you could approach that for projects, depending on how much that project was. And then we can fund capability and capacity building activities. And we'll go into that in a couple of minutes here, but the CNCB is what we call them. These are another category. And what this is building codes, partnerships, project scoping, and planning activities. But it's really important to note this can only be part of that tribal set-aside, or a state set-aside if a state is applying, of course. So what this means is if you are applying for a project scoping, so let's say you have a project, but you want to get some design work done, do some engineering analysis, you want to apply for that project scoping for $2 million. So again, not the project, just project scoping. No, it would have to be within that 1 million because it's only part of the tribal set aside or state set aside. So it's very important to know it can only be up to that 1 million federal share, any of those 4 activities. Next slide. So what is this capability and capacity building activities, the CNCB? What did that actually include and what does that mean? So these, again, remember, they can only be part of that tribal or state set aside. And it includes things like building codes. So this is an activity type. And that could be things like evaluating your building codes in the community. You could consider adoption, evaluate what codes you need to adopt or implement. You could enhance existing codes. You could develop a professional workforce. So let's say, you know, your tribal government needs professionals to understand the building codes better. You could help pay for training, conferences, items like that for an official who is going to work building codes in your community. Another option here is partnerships. So this is another type of activity. And what this is, it's very broad. So these are just some examples. Pursuing knowledge transfer between parties, so maybe things like conferences, attending regional conferences that can help support that knowledge sharing, finding partners to help your community. Maybe there's some knowledge gaps and you can help address that through partnership development. So conferences, trainings, anything to help support that partnership development. Conducting a capability a gap analysis to determine where partnerships can be helpful. So maybe, you know, you can do an analysis there of what your tribe is lacking and what kind of partnerships it needs to pursue to get, you know, more funding in certain mitigation areas, for example. You know, another thing I think of the top of my head, maybe you want to pursue a partnership with, okay, I'm totally throwing out an idea here, a partnership with the county that you reside in or maybe is next door to work through, let's say, like developing, you know, some type of GIS system to understand mutual hazards or something like that. You know, that's, you could work, you know, a partnership with a county or city or perhaps another tribe. Yeah, so really pursuing that knowledge transfer between partners, whatever that partner may look like to you. Next slide. All right, so more for that CNCB activities. So it also includes project scoping. And you may have heard of advanced assistance. That is what it was called under the pre-disaster mitigation program. But it's now called project scoping in BRIC. So it's the same thing. We just call it now project scoping. And what this is there's a couple different options. It could be scoping projects. So perhaps you know the hazard, you know a project you want to do, but you need some engineering design, things like that. Or it could be collecting data for a benefit cost analysis, EHP compliance, environmental and historic preservation compliance, that stands for, or other program requirements. So let's say you know what this project is, but you want to hire someone to, or you know, internally you want to write that application and do a benefit cost analysis and create this application for a next funding cycle. That could be also funded under project scoping. Or something like evaluating facilities. So this is a good example if you perhaps know a hazard but don't really know what you want to do about it yet. Perhaps your area floods, but you don't know what, let's say, what homes are the most critical and flooding the most, which ones you want to look at for funding to do different activities for. That is a great example of a type of project scoping. So looking at what type of projects you could have for different facilities or parts of your community that are affected by a hazard. And then here at the bottom, you'll see mitigation planning and planning related activities. So we'll go into this later, but a hazard mitigation plan is required for any other type of grant besides a hazard mitigation plan. So if you don't have a hazard mitigation plan now, that's something you definitely want to apply for. And this funding can also help pay for a plan. So if you don't have a plan for your community currently, or perhaps you already have one, but you need a hazard mitigation plan update because they're valid for 5 years. So perhaps you're coming up on that 5 years and you want to make sure that your plan is getting updated, so you're applying for a plan update. You can also do things like integrate information from that mitigation plan into another planning effort. So let's say you already have that hazard mitigation plan and you want to take information from it and capture it in another plan, such as the comprehensive plan or a development plan. That is also an eligible activity. Or perhaps you want to procure some identification, hazard identification or mapping, or kind of like GIS-related software and equipment that would be available under hazard mitigation planning related activities as well. Next slide. And BRIC can also fund management costs. So what are management costs? So it's really important to think of management costs as a bucket here. So management costs can fund any indirect costs and administrative expenses when administering an award or sub-award. So what that means is what I like to kind of explain how management costs works is management costs can include indirect costs, but they don't have to. So you could apply for management costs that are for administering your grant, such as let's say you're going to do all your drawdowns, you want to have staff time accounted for that, you want to fill out quarterly reports, you want staff time for that, or you could have a mix of indirect costs. But it's really important to note here that our management costs per our NOFO does establish that indirect costs are also part of management costs. And you'll see that there on your second bullet per the guidance and that notice of funding opportunity, including this year's, I noticed that now, fiscal year 21, indirect costs are only available as management costs. So you can now submit through 2 different options if you want to receive management costs or indirect costs. So you can do a separate sub-application for management costs of up to 10% of that application. So let's say you're submitting like 2 projects, it would be 10% of the total of those 2 projects. And that would be a separate sub-application. And now you're also able to do 5% of that actual sub-application. So we say project sub-application there, but it could be 5% of any sub-application budget. And that would be like, so let's say you're doing a hazard mitigation plan, and 5% of that would be within that budget. So that's not a separate one, but it's in that specific sub-application. Whereas the grant management would be for that grant level and can be 10% of all the sub-applications. And it's really important to note here now with BRIC, if you are a tribe applying directly to FEMA as a grant applicant, you can apply for both of these. So if you are looking for the most advantageous route for your tribe, the most advantageous route for you is to apply for a grant management application, the sub-application for grant management, so 10% of that total grant application budget, and include that 5% for management costs in that individual sub-application. So like that planning example I gave you. Of course, you certainly don't have to, but that is the most advantageous route if you are interested in that. And also you'll see at the bottom and the left of your screen, if you're requesting indirect costs, you must include the tribe's negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. If you don't include that, we will ask you for it after the selections are made by our headquarters. So if you include it in your application, it's just one last thing for us to request. Next slide. So BRIC can also fund pre-award costs. And what are pre-award costs? So these are costs related directly to developing your BRIC grant or grant sub-application. So that's really important to note. It has to be directly related. And it's only it's only funded if your grant is selected and funded. So for example, you know, if you submit a project and you wanted pre-award costs captured in that, and your project didn't get selected in a national competition, that would be something like you wouldn't get reimbursed for. You wouldn't get those pre-award costs reimbursed if it wasn't selected and funded. So here's some examples. Application development. So let's say, so right now, if I am part of a tribal government, I would be looking at my funding opportunities. I would be thinking, okay, I'm going to apply to BRIC. I'm going to start working on my application. I'm going to start tracking my time and putting that in my budget as a pre-award cost. So that way, if this project or, you know, whatever the subgrants and grant is are selected, that staff time can be captured as a pre-award cost. It also can include things like engineering reports or conceptual design for projects. So if that's something that you needed to complete for your project, you can include that as a pre-award cost. Perhaps you're submitting a project and you are doing a benefit cost analysis yourself, or you're hiring someone. That is something that you could also apply for as a pre-award cost in your sub-application. Environmental analysis, if there's any analysis needed for that, perhaps you need to do some more in-depth environmental reviews from, let's say, you know, maybe you need to take more in-depth photos to show a historic site. That you could capture as a pre-award cost. And then if you're doing any community outreach or meetings to make sure that whatever you're applying for is something that your community wants, that would be something that can be eligible for a pre-award cost. Next slide. All right, so what are some other features of BRIC? We do have a new feature for the BRIC program that's called Direct Technical Assistance. So what is this? It's not financial, so you're not going to receive this in a grant award. And it's really up to the tribe to define what this need is. So perhaps you know of some hazards and you need assistance looking at some projects that could help, you know, lessen that impact to your community from that hazard. Or perhaps you are looking for, you know, maybe someone to help, you know, explain the grant programs, you know, a bit more heavily to you, walk through your community with that, with you on those. It really is up to you to define what that is. And so how you apply for this, please do look at the NOFO for that, but you do apply just through a basic letter, so that there's no really prescriptive how the letter must look. That is, it's really basic, however you want to define what it is and how that letter looks. For those very specifics, like where to send that, see the notice of funding opportunity. But again, this is what I do want to emphasize here is there's only 20 selected nationally. And I noticed we forgot to update something on that screen, but there's now 20 selected nationally, so that's more than one per region. So ignore that portion. But this year there's 20. Last year was only 10. And this year is now 20 nationally. And I do want to highlight this because it can be, you know, although it's not financial, it's kind of up to you to decide what your tribal government needs and how we could help you through that non-financial technical assistance for mitigation. And last year, our region, FEMA Region 10, did not really receive many. So really take a look and consider if there's something that your community would find beneficial, and look at that notice of funding opportunity for how you send in your letter. Next slide. All right, so let's do a knowledge check. All righty, so on your screen you should see some questions, and it says, please click all the items that are applicable to the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. So A, a tribal set-aside is up to $1 million federal share per tribe. B, projects over the tribal set-aside of $1 million will go to the competition. C, non-financial direct technical assistance is available, but only 20 selected nationally. Or D, all projects are non-competitive. All right, so those are your options. So make sure you check all that apply, and we will circle back in a minute here. All right, let's take a second and finish answering these questions or this poll question. So remember, click all of the items that apply, and we will see what everyone thinks. All righty here. So let's see. Most people got this pretty correct. So the answer was A, B, and C. And that those are, so remember, this is what are applicable and eligible for building resilient infrastructure and communities program. And that would be A, the tribal set-aside is up to 1 million federal share per tribe. B, projects over that tribal set-aside of 1 million go to the competition. And C, non-financial direct technical assistance is available and only 20 are nationally selected. So D, all projects are non-competitive, is incorrect. Any project over that 1 million federal share would go into that national competition. So not all projects are non-competitive. Only ones submitted in a set-aside, a tribal set-aside, are non-competitive. All right, and we have a few questions here in the chat that I want to address here. Let's see. Okay, so when our tribe did our hazard mitigation plan, we were told erosion wasn't allowable. Can we revisit and update our plan before we apply for a project? Yeah, erosion is a natural hazard that can be looked at in your hazard mitigation plan. You know, sometimes this is addressed in areas like flooding, but there is also coastal erosion, so you could definitely include coastal erosion items like that in your hazard mitigation plan. I also see here, is it 15% of the federal share for management costs or 15% of the total project costs? So it's so for management costs, it's if you're doing a separate sub-application for management costs, right? So that's that 10%. It's 10% of the total project cost. So let's say your project is you're submitting sub-applications that are up to a total, like 2 sub-applications. They're $250,000, and they obviously 250 times 2 equals 500,000. So it'd be 10% of that would be your sub-application. So 50,000 would be your management cost application. And then you could do 5% in each sub-application. So let's say, you know, 5% of that 250,000. So maybe your projects were like 237,000, and then 5% was that sub-application management cost. There's grant management costs at 10%, and there's sub-application management costs at 5%. The grant management costs, they're at that grant level, and they're at a separate sub-application, and that 5% sub-application management costs are in that sub-application. And then I also see here, is there a match requirement for the management cost sub-application? No, there is not. So if you are applying for that 10% sub-application for management costs, that is 100% federal share, and that is new under BRIC, so that's exciting. So no, there is not a match requirement for that management cost of 10%. For everything else there is though. So if you're doing a plan, a hazard mitigation plan, a project, there is the match for those items. All right, let's move on here. so what does the application process and timeline look like? Next slide. Okay. So applying for BRIC. So the first thing to know is you have to have a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan. So if you don't have one of these, you can only apply for a hazard mitigation plan. You can't apply for project scoping. You can't apply for building codes. You can't apply for a project. You need to have a hazard mitigation plan that's been FEMA approved. So if you don't have one at this point, you really want to apply for a hazard mitigation plan so you can get that plan completed, and that way in the future years you are eligible for other types of funding. The application and sub-application submittal. So it's done in FEMA grant outcomes. FEMA Go is what it's called. And because this is a relatively new system, it was new to BRIC for fiscal year 20, we really recommend registering as soon as possible. So if your tribe has not registered in this, it's really important to look at this as soon as you can to register, because it does require some alignment with other systems. So you want to make sure that your contact information is up to date, for example, in SAM's system for application management. So you definitely want to look at something like that now if you're interested in applying for BRIC. You want to make sure that you have that FEMA Go system ready, so when you work on your application, you're ready to go. Next slide. All right, so what is the evaluation criteria? So first evaluation is done basically on the notice of funding opportunity and the HMA guidance. So a lot of the times, any what we call requests for information after selection, or just our basic review before something is moved on to our headquarters for selection, we are looking at the NOFO and the HMA guidance to make sure that it meets these requirements. Now the technical criteria and the qualitative criteria you'll see in the middle there, those are done for the competitive projects. And there is really clear, explicit criteria for competitive projects that are for those. And it's listed in the NOFO, and there's also program support material that you'll see a link to towards the end, and we'll go over in a slide in a moment as well. And then financial integrity criteria. This is the risk assessment. There's also some general information about this in the notice of funding opportunity, but it's to make sure, essentially that federal grants are handled properly. Your financial controls are in place to accept a federal grant. And now, we really recommend, if you're applying especially for a competition project, you're reviewing the technical and qualitative criteria in the NOFO. Because this is what projects, especially the national competition projects, are looked at against, you want to make sure that you're looking at this to help strengthen your project, to make sure you're meeting the items in those criteria, so that way you have a better chance of your project being selected. Next slide. Okay, so what is the technical criteria? So this is listed in the NOFO, and there's also a program support material listed on the end of our website, or our presentation here for that. And basically, I say what it is essentially yes or no, but think of it as yes or no, and then each of these items, they have a point associated with them, a certain number of points. So not all have the same points, like, not all are 10 points each, but they have a point assigned to them. And so what it means with yes or no, so like infrastructure project, does the project address infrastructure in some way? Is it mitigating against a hazard to infrastructure? If the project is, let's say, elevating Brenna's house because it floods, that's not infrastructure, right? So that would be like yes or no. That's a quick no, right? So you want to make sure if you're applying for projects in the national competition that you're looking at this to see how you can meet it, because you essentially can score yourself. So you can see here how well you might do in that national competition by what you can score here yourself. So as you can see, just some of the examples on your screen, there are points for increased non-federal cost share. So let's say you're applying to 30% of your application, and the government will pay for 70% of the cost share. That could be an increased cost share. You can get points for being designated as an economically disadvantaged rural community. Remember that 90-10 cost share and having that documentation. So it's really important to look at that in the NOFO, but also to look at that program support material that walks through each one of these and what explicitly it says. Next slide, please. So what's the qualitative criteria? This is the next scoring for the national competition. And these are more so open-ended opposed to yes or no. So what this means is FEMA will convene panels, and the panel, it can be a mix of tribes, nonprofits, local communities, state agencies, federal agencies, FEMA, and they will look through each of these criteria questions and for how the project addresses those. And again, there's a program support material for these, so I really recommend looking for that. And we also, I also want to note that come spring, late winter, springtime, FEMA does look for people to participate in these panels. So if you're interested in participating in one to see, to kind of score, nationally and work with other professionals working in mitigation across the U.S., if you would like to participate in a panel, we do send an email out about that. So please make sure to look out for that because you do have an opportunity to participate in panels as well to look at these qualitative criteria questions for national competition program projects. Excuse me. Next slide. And that qualitative and technical criteria, we will get into that more in the project webinar. So if you are really, on the edge of your seat wanting to know more about that, we will also get into that more in the project webinar. Okay, so the life cycle of a BRIC application. So we want to include this slides because we know that there can be a lot of things that you don't see behind the scenes. And so once you submit your application, it can be kind of confusing what actually happens. So our notice of funding was released in early August. So that was summer of 2021. So that application period opens. And what that means is you can submit your application in FEMA Go, or you can start developing it on September 30th, so just in a couple weeks here. So the submission deadline then for applications, so if you're a tribe applying directly to FEMA, is January 28th, 2022. So if you're a tribe applying through a state as a sub-applicant, you definitely want to meet with your state and find when that state application is due because they might have their own earlier date so they can do their own reviews. But if you're applied directly to FEMA, that deadline is January 28th, 2022. And then selections and pre-award selection notices, what that means is after all of the regional reviews and then headquarters does the reviews, they will put out a long list on the FEMA website of what has been selected and what has not been selected, and this announces in summer of 2022. And then the grant award, it's made, this is a slightly error, so I apologize for that. The grant award, whether it's made directly to the state or the tribe, so whoever that grant recipient is, that direct applicant, it is estimated for December of 2022 or after. And we say in after because it depends on the complexity of the application. For example, if very little information was provided in the sub-application and we have to review it a lot regionally and go back and forth to make sure the minimum requirements are met, it may take a little bit longer. If you have a very complex project that requires an environmental and historic preservation review that's very in-depth, that might take a little bit longer. So for example, let's say you're disturbing a lot of ground, on a potentially historical archaeological site, that might take a lot longer than a hazard mitigation plan to get awarded. So we like to say December of 2022 or after. And we also, note that it does depend on what we receive, whether, our team receives hundreds and hundreds of applications to award. It can kind of change that timeline as well because we are just one team, although we are expanding. Period of performance. So what is that? The start date for your grant is when that recipient, so you as the federally recognized tribe or the state, accepts the award. And what's the end date? So that would be 36 months from that date of award. So when you sign that award paperwork, it's 36 months from that date. And then closeout. This is really important. You are required to do what's called a closeout, and this is due after 90 days of the period of performance. And it basically is a letter requesting closeout of your grant, depending if you have any de-obligations, so money that you did not spend for the sub-applications or the grant. And then, various other things like your last quarterly reports that were due, perhaps photos if it's a project, perhaps how you met environmental conditions if it's a project. If it's a plan, you can include a copy of the FEMA approval letter. So it really depends, but a closeout package is due 90 days after your period of performance ends. Next slide. Okay, so reminder, that application deadline, it is January 28, 2022, and it's 3 p.m. Eastern time. So it's really important to remember, it's Eastern time. We really recommend submitting 2 weeks early. And the reason why is, just like any system, things can get bogged down as everyone's trying to submit at the last minute. Additionally, we recommend submitting 2 weeks early in case you run into an issue with the system. So let's say you're getting a strange error code, your registration isn't working, for example, you need to add someone who doesn't have access currently. We just like to say 2 weeks early because we can just get those issues addressed instead of, on January 28th and having to address it very last minute. So really recommend submitting that 2 weeks early, and then, you got it off your hands, that it's been submitted. And again, they have to be submitted, your grant and your sub-grant applications in the FEMA Go system. So that's the link for it, and the NOFO has it as well, but it has to be submitted there. Next slide. All right, so what kind of resources are out there? Next slide. Excuse me. FEMA Go resources. So there on that link there is going to be some more manuals for FEMA Go, as well as has some links to some videos for registering items like that if you have not registered. And perhaps you're joining us today thinking about BRIC, but you're not really sure if it's for you and your tribe yet. You can also print out blank PDF applications. I believe they actually might be Word documents, but you could print these out and see what is actually required to be filled out so you can kind of gauge whether or not you're interested in this funding opportunity. And there is also a help desk there with the email and at that number. Both are real people trying to address the system, and they're your best contact for FEMA Go issues. We may be able to help minor issues, but we're also new in the system as well. So a lot of the time we do refer people to that if you are having issues. Next slide. So here's more additional program resources. So the first is that BRIC website. And it has items like, before you apply, what you should be looking at, what you should accomplish. And then resources. In these resources, you're going to find program support materials. And I can't emphasize these more because they're extremely helpful. They go into every type of CNCB activity, so those planning, project scoping, partnerships, all those type of activities and what they mean. And it also goes into things like that national scoring criteria for projects, the technical and qualitative scoring. So there's I believe 7 of them, and they're extremely helpful. So please do take a look at those. And then our BRIC regional webinars. Not our webinar, our regional, These are our headquarters webinars. They still have some occurring right now, as well as some recorded ones. So you can register there, or you can watch the recorded ones as well. Those are our national ones conducted by FEMA headquarters. And our HMA guidance and resources. So again, this is our main guidance document in addition to those program support materials and the NOFO. This is the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance. We really recommend downloading a copy of that. For example, it has a list of everything required in a planning sub-application. So you can go ahead and check that to make sure that you've checked all the boxes before you submit. Region 10 webinars and resources. And then we have finally here our planning, our tribal webinar series. That's the link, and you've probably found it since you're here today. And then here is our tribal webinar schedule. So again, today we're here September 16th. And next Thursday, we're going to be looking at the capability and capacity building topic of planning and application development. So that hazard mitigation planning, what is it? Why is it beneficial to your community, and what it looks like. So what we want to see in your application and things to make sure your application includes for that. And again, really helpful if you need a plan update, take a look at this one, and or if you perhaps don't have a hazard mitigation plan and need one, really important to watch. These are also going to be recorded and available after the fact, and it might take a couple of weeks, so do note that, but they will also be available as recordings as well if you are unable to attend any of these. We've also now added a new one this year, as you can see at the bottom of your screen, for FEMA grants management. And this will go over some basic grants management things, such as procurement, some basic procurement guidelines that federal grants have to adhere to, as well as items like quarterly reporting. What is quarterly reporting? When are they due? What do they look like? We'll go into things like that because, as we saw way earlier on, if you're a tribe applying directly to FEMA, that grants management is going to look a bit different than if you're a sub-applicant applying to your state. There's a bit more work involved, so we want to set everyone up for success, and so we're going to be looking at some grants management items and go over some of those basics. Next slide. All right, so this is our team. So you'll see this email first up top. This is a live email. These are the faces behind it. Because we cover such a large territory here in Region 10, Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and Alaska, as well as 271 tribes. We do have a general email, so we can all manage it, as well as when new inquiries come in. So if you have any inquiry between our next webinar, please reach out to us. That is our email address. And here is everyone on our team. So you can see Rob on the far left, Cindy or Cynthia right there. I'm in the middle there. Brenna, I'm the one speaking today. Kayla, she's also been speaking as well. You've heard her pop in through some questions. And then Robbie right there on the far right. This is our non-disaster team here in the Hazard Mitigation Assistance branch. Next slide. And lastly, here is our great Tribal Affairs team. So as you work through the different programs within FEMA, you might find that perhaps mitigation is not the program you're looking for. Maybe there's something else that can assist your tribe. These are our Region 10 tribal liaisons, and they are the ones who help make that connection for you for the program or person you might be in need of that contact information. They can refer you to other resources. They are the ones to really make that connection beyond mitigation, since we in HMA only work in that mitigation section. So you'll see Jay there on your left, Aurora, Aaron, and then Ramona on your far right. And Ramona does work solely for Alaska, or she works for FEMA, but she works for the tribes in Alaska. So if you are participating today from an Alaska village, or Native village or tribe, Ramona is your tribal liaison there. Next slide.